I think it's safe to say those 4 weeks that my father-in-law and mother-in-law were trapped in Gaza were the 4 most difficult weeks of our lives. I couldn't, as a husband, comfort my wife to say that her parents would come back alive. And although I occupied what was arguably the most powerful political office in Scotland, I was, quite frankly, utterly helpless. At one point, the Foreign Secretary wouldn't even pick up the phone to talk to me.
He wouldn't pick up the phone?
And frankly, quite often, we lecture other countries about. So a complete and utter betrayal of, a country that prides itself often on being the standard bearers of international human rights law and the global rules-based order, and then suddenly allowing Israel to act with complete and utter impunity, even where British citizens were involved and had the threat of death and being killed during the Israeli bombardment post-October the 7th, an absolute betrayal. Remember, there's been more arms sales to Israel by the Labour government in a short period of time than there has been the entire time that the Conservatives were in power. There's not many people who actually believe that international human rights law is worth the paper now that it's written on, given the impunity with which Israel has been allowed to commit its genocide.
Humza Yousaf, thank you for speaking to Middle East Eye.
Pleasure.
From March 2023 until May last year, you were the Scottish First Minister. You were the first Muslim leader of a Western democracy. But about a year ago, you revealed that you were actually reconsidering whether you and your family would stay in Britain and in Europe. Why was this?
Don't get me wrong, I'm Scottish to the core. Born in Scotland, raised in Scotland, raising a family in Scotland, and as you rightly say, also had the enormous pleasure of leading my country for a period. I don't want to leave Scotland. I don't want to leave the UK. To me, it's the only country I call home. But let's not forget just how far a rise we've seen in support for the far right. We are speaking less than a fortnight ago from when 150,000 people took to the nation's capital, rallying behind Tommy Robinson, a man who's a convicted fraudster and thug who called Islam a violent and fascist ideology. And speaker after speaker at that rally made Islamophobic and anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim statements to the point of encouraging, in my view, extremism. So my responsibility is not actually first and foremost as a former First Minister or a Member of Parliament in Scotland. My first responsibility is as a father to 3 beautiful girls and as a husband to my wife. And I've got to think to myself, are my children and family going to be safe in this country? I don't want to be forced out, and I'll fight damn hard to stay here. But will they be safe in the future being Muslim in this country? I think the answer to that is, at the very least, uncertain.
Well, that's quite bleak, isn't it? Because many Muslims would be thinking Humza Yousaf is the ultimate Scottish Muslim success story, and you're considering having to leave the country, even the possibility of it. I mean, that shows that we're in quite a dark situation.
We're in a very dark situation, the darkest that I can remember. Let's just again cast our mind back to this rally just around a fortnight ago. Speaking at that rally was Katie Hopkins, somebody who has echoed Nazi rhetoric by saying that there should be, and I'll quote her, a final solution to deal with the problem of Muslims. Lawrence Fox, who said, and I'll quote again, that Islam must be permanently removed from the United Kingdom. Then we had far-right Belgian politicians saying that Islam doesn't belong in Europe or the United Kingdom. We had a Christian evangelist from New Zealand saying that you have to ban halal, ban Islam, ban mosques, ban temples, ban shrines from this country. And there was 150,000 people cheering that on. So the threat to Muslims in the UK and Europe is existential. Now, I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm going to fight the far right as much as I can using the platform that I have. And I hope the decent majority who don't support the likes of Tommy Robinson will be our allies in that fight.
Well, on that point, let's talk about Reform UK, the party led by Nigel Farage. This is a proper political party. It's got MPs in Parliament. they're proposing deporting 600,000 people within 5 years. I mean, that is a staggering number. You would have to build huge detention centres in the countryside. They're proposing getting rid of indefinite leave to remain after 5 years for migrants. I mean, this is taking us into uncharted territory in terms of these ideas and this rhetoric, isn't it?
Well, Nigel Farage's plans and policies are not only economically illiterate, they're morally reprehensible. So let's take the economically illiterate part first. Nigel Farage is suggesting scrapping indefinite leave to remain. So people that have come here to work, pay taxes, contribute, play by the rules, and you're going to take away their indefinite leave to remain, put them in a revolving door of visa renewals. Businesses are going to have to pay every few years for the admin costs, the surcharge costs, the visa renewal costs. And at a time where our economy is already struggling, it makes no sense, none whatsoever. And it's also economically illiterate, because you and I are talking at a time when the United Kingdom has the lowest birth rate on record, far below the 2.1 that's required in order to make sure that your population can continue at its current level. And of course, we have an ageing population, and that's the situation across most of Europe, certainly most of Western Europe. So this country's economic prosperity is absolutely intertwined with ensuring that we have migration from outside of the European Union. So completely economically illiterate, morally reprehensible because it's threatening to tear families apart. Those that are British citizens who are married to those with indefinite leave to remain, what will happen with their husbands or wives? They might have to leave, be torn apart from their children. What about those who came from Afghanistan, who risked their life and certain death under the Taliban to work with the British as interpreters? They'll get their indefinite leave to remain removed and deported. What about those that have come from Hong Kong? Again, risked their lives and their liberty in terms of taking on the Chinese government. Well, what will happen to them? And of course, a significant proportion of those in ILR are NHS workers and social care workers. So completely economically illiterate, completely morally reprehensible, and just a sign of the fact that when reform comes under scrutiny, the proposals completely fall apart.
What do you make of the Labour government's response to this rising anti-migrant, anti-Muslim rhetoric?
I'm afraid that the Labour Party has, over the years, been complicit in appeasing that far-right rhetoric. They've mainstreamed it for many decades, and the Conservatives are the same. Instead of confronting that anti-migrant rhetoric, what Prime Ministers and successive Prime Ministers, including Keir Starmer, should have done is stand up to the far right, present a bold alternative, a radical alternative, and one that is grounded in the economic reality that this country needs migration for its very economic prosperity. And said migration has been good for this country, multiculturalism has been good for this country, it's a strength of ours as a nation, and here's why I'm supporting it. Instead, what they've tried to do is appease the far right, adopt the language, legitimise that rhetoric. I'm afraid, as Keir Starmer is finding out in opinion poll after opinion poll, you cannot out Farage Nigel Farage.
So do you believe an independent Scotland would be better for Scottish Muslims?
100%. It'd be better for Scottish people, full stop, including Muslims, to be frank. That's not to say Scotland is immune from the rise of the far right. I'm afraid over the last few weeks in Scotland, we've seen, for example, outside of hotels that are housing asylum seekers, people throwing Nazi salutes. In Scotland, we've seen people holding up signs that say, "Kill them all." So this is dangerous in dark times in Scotland as well. Look, with independence at the very least, believe that we'd be able to, well, first of all, in the Scottish Parliament, as we've seen over the years, have a general consensus that's pro-migration. That's what we've had over the last 25 years, maintain that, because Scotland needs migration. Our birth rate is even lower than that in England and Wales, at historic lows of 1.25. What would they also be able to do, what I hope we would do, much like our neighbours in Ireland, is say that Scotland is a welcoming place, invest in migration upskilling, invest in English classes, and invest in making sure that migrants come here to fulfil the vacancies that we have in both the public and the private sector.
And did you feel when you were First Minister that you were personally affected by racism or Islamophobia?
Of course I was affected by Islamophobia and racism. Islamophobia in particular. The higher profile you get, the more you speak out. I'm afraid the more the forces of the far right come for you. Look, those threats were deemed to be so credible that my family and I had to walk around with not just panic alarms, but we had to talk to my then 14-year-old daughter about how to secure herself in our safe room in our home. That's not a conversation any parent should have to have with their teenage daughter or teenage child. But that's how credible those threats were. So look, that continues to affect me to this day. It certainly won't stop me from speaking out.
We're speaking here in London ahead of the launch of the Muslim Impact Forum. What's this about?
The Muslim Impact Forum is hugely important. It's a forum that brings together thought leaders, activists, politicians, those in the media, philanthropists, CEOs, business people, charities, NGOs, from the Muslim world, right across the Muslim world, to come together and say humanity, not just the Muslim community, humanity faces some significant challenges. How do we use our collective expertise, collective wealth, collective generosity, collective intellect in order to tackle the biggest challenges that humanity faces? And I think forums like the Muslim Impact Forum are needed now more than ever before.
And we've talked about the dangers facing Muslims in Britain, but what makes you optimistic about Muslim communities across Britain as well?
Yeah, I think it's important to have optimism because I've painted quite a dark picture, and it's true, it is quite a dark place at the moment. But there is reason to be optimistic. First of all, I think that the vast, overwhelming, sometimes silent majority are very much appreciative of not just Muslims, but the multicultural nation that we live in. We know that, and we know that when it comes to, for example, our football teams and our Olympic teams and our cricket teams, we think of those across the nations, across the 4 nations of the UK. They are so multicultural in their makeup and their diversity. And I think it's really important that our allies speak up as well. Non-Muslim allies join with the Muslim allies. Look, what makes me hopeful and optimistic is I've seen how much talent there is, how much creativity is, how much ingenuity there is, how much wealth and talent there is within the Muslim community. I've got no doubt if that can be harnessed collectively, then we can overcome these obstacles and overcome these challenges.
Thank you for speaking about that. I want to turn now to a particularly heavy topic, and that's Gaza. You were Scottish First Minister for about half a year during Israel's genocide in Gaza. Now, your wife had family in Gaza. At the exact same time, the Tory government in Westminster was full-throatedly supporting Israel's actions. What did that feel like?
I think it's safe to say those 4 weeks that my father-in-law and mother-in-law were trapped in Gaza were the 4 most difficult weeks of our lives. I couldn't, as a husband, comfort my wife to say that her parents would come back alive. And although I occupied what was arguably the most powerful political office in Scotland, I was, quite frankly, utterly helpless. At one point, the Foreign Secretary wouldn't even pick up the phone to talk to me.
He wouldn't pick up the phone?
No, he had to get shamed into giving me a call. James Cleverly, Foreign Secretary at the time. I was asked interview after interview if the Foreign Secretary had been in touch, and I gave the honest answer, which was no. And only once the outrage over that spilled out and came onto his desk did he bother picking up the phone to me to say, and I didn't expect any special treatment at all, but to simply give me an update as First Minister what was happening, as well as saying this is what we're able to do in terms of British nationals, including your family, who are there in Gaza. So look, the UK government, in my view, were an obstacle more than they were a help. That's not to impugn the reputation at all of civil servants. I think the FCDO team on the ground were doing everything they possibly could, but I'm afraid the full-throated support of the UK government at the time, and I'm afraid carried on by the current UK government, makes them utterly complicit in what's happening.
Did you feel it was a betrayal by the British government?
Of course it was a betrayal, not just of me personally and my family personally, but a betrayal, I think, of the humanitarian values that we take such pride in. And frankly, quite often we lecture other countries about. So a complete and utter betrayal of, a country that prides itself often on being the standard bearers of international human rights law and the global rules-based order, and then suddenly allowing Israel to act with complete and utter impunity, even where British citizens were involved and had the threat of death and being killed. during the Israeli bombardment post-October the 7th, an absolute betrayal.
Well, we now have a Labour government. They've been in power for over a year, and there have been some significant policy changes. There's a partial arms embargo, they've sanctioned 2 far-right Israeli ministers, and most recently they've recognised a Palestinian state. How do you assess the Labour government's policy on Israel?
While I welcome the recognition of the Palestinian state, albeit over 75 years overdue, it doesn't whitewash the complicity of the Labour government. Remember, there's been more arms sales to Israel by the Labour government in a short period of time than there has been the entire time that the Conservatives were in power. So we have a significant issue. I think that was uncovered actually by Middle East Eye. And so we have here a government that's complicit, that may well talk and provide strong statements around some of the horrors in Gaza on the one hand, and on the other hand continue to sell arms. And you said the partial arms embargo, well, 10%, I'm afraid, is even stretching the word partial, to be frank. 90% of export licenses are able to still go ahead. And when we talk about sanctions, I'm afraid those sanctions have not been meaningful. We need meaningful economic and trade sanctions. And we need now to treat Israel the way that apartheid South Africa was treated. And there needs to be a cultural and sporting boycott of Israel, because it's the only language that, frankly, Israel is going to understand.
There is also military cooperation between Britain and Israel. So Britain shares intelligence with Israel, some of it gathered from spy planes that fly over Gaza on a daily basis. This intelligence, the Ministry of Defence insists, is for hostage rescue, but there's significant secrecy around what this intelligence is, what exactly it's used for, what Israel then uses it for. So do you fear that Britain's complicity with what Israel's doing in Gaza goes deeper than anyone actually knows?
I don't doubt that the UK's complicity goes much deeper than we've been able to cover, and fantastic journalists have been able to cover thus far. Let's be clear and let's remind ourselves that Israel is headed by a man who's wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Israel, according to a UN Commission report, is committing genocide in Gaza. And of course that UN Commission report is only the latest. We have the International Association of Genocide Scholars who have said the same.
But the British government have said that they won't make that judgment.
Of course, and that again, the UK government choosing to sit this one out when authoritative experts have said a genocide had taken place is abysmal, given that other world governments have said it's a genocide. Spanish government, the Irish government, Scottish government, for example, have all said that the evidence is abundantly clear that a genocide is taking place. Even if you don't believe a genocide is taking place, even if you don't believe the evidence of your own eyes, at the very least, war crimes are being committed, and we've seen evidence of that. Mass starvation is taking place. Keir Starmer has called that mass starvation a moral outrage. Well, if something is so outrageous morally, how do you morally justify selling weapons, ensuring that your RAF continues with its reconnaissance flights and provides intelligence to the IDF? How do you continue to even, as they were doing until recently, training IDF soldiers? I mean, it's just, I'm afraid the complicity is so deep, so entrenched, that one day I hope the UK government is held to account for it.
There was just last week a royal banquet for US President Donald Trump. Now, the US has sanctioned the ICC chief prosecutor, sanctioned ICC judges, and there are now rumours that they could sanction the ICC as an institution. Do you fear for the future of the international rules-based order?
The international rules-based order is teetering on the brink of collapse. There's not many people who actually believe that international human rights law is worth the paper now that it's written on, given the impunity with which Israel has been allowed to commit its genocide. And that is shameful, because if we don't have the international rules-based order, then I'm afraid conflict will be even more prevalent than it currently is. There'll be no disincentive for war. In fact, if anything, there'll be incentive for war. If you think you can conquer and expand your territory, you can conquer your neighbour, you can take all their minerals and their goods and their wealth, you can kill their people, and you've got a chance of winning that war and there's no accountability, then why on earth would you not take that chance? Because the rules-based order doesn't exist. And any moral authority the UK and the US may have had, and I think it was relatively thin even before this, but any moral authority they had, well, that just has evaporated. They cannot lecture anybody on human rights anymore, given their abysmal complicity in the genocide in Gaza.
The Israeli president was in the UK just a few weeks ago, had a meeting with Keir Starmer.
Again, Isaac Herzog, whose own statements were used in that UN Commission report to prove intent of genocide, when of course Isaac Herzog said that the entire nation, the entire people of Gaza were responsible for October the 7th, is given the red carpet treatment and invited into number 10 Downing Street by Keir Starmer. It is so outrageous that there will come a time in our future where our children will read about this dark chapter in their history books and wondered how on earth we allowed it to happen.
So the Prime Minister welcomed the Israeli President to Downing Street. At the same time, the Foreign Secretary was using very strong words to denounce Israel's action in Gaza. Do you feel that there's a fundamental incoherence in British policy, or is it by design?
Look, I think it's done by design. Those pictures of Keir Starmer shaking hands with President Isaac Herzog will haunt Keir Starmer for his entire life. He knows he was shaking hands with a man who has green-lit genocide, who has allowed it to take place. And making these statements, saying the situation in Gaza is intolerable, morally unjustifiable and morally outrageous, and at the same time helping to arm the very government that is taking these actions and of course committing this genocide, is not just incoherence, it is, as I keep saying, absolute complicity.
And finally, the British media. Do you think that it's failed to do its job in holding our politicians to account on what's happening in Gaza and their policy towards it?
Well, look, let me not tar the whole British media with one brush, because I think there's very good examples. Talking to you today, I think there's some very good journalists who have ensured that certain complicity and actions are uncovered. But I have to say I'm pretty disappointed, despondent in fact, that so many journalists have either been silent or even worse, have been mouthpieces for the Netanyahu government when so many of their own colleagues have been killed. Remember one report from Brown University suggesting more journalists killed in Gaza than in all the other conflicts post-World War II combined. And even if that stat is challenged from the university report, then at the very least we know hundreds have been killed, people in media. And yet some journalists support the Israeli regime despite what's been done to their colleagues in Gaza. So there's been too much silence, and in some cases too much complicity. But let's also hail those journalists who've put their neck in the line, quite frankly, their head above the parapet, and spoken out at a time when so few have.
Humza Yousaf, thank you very much for speaking to Middle East Eye.
Pleasure as always.